Jefferson was saying that because we are based in the public opinion or regime, I rather prefer to have a government, a newspaper without a government than a government without newspapers, because the newspapers and the freedom of speech are the basis of democracy. The first laws in all the new constitutions in 19th century were the freedom of speech and freedom of printing. That
Pick the phone up.
no, it's not my. So I can take it here. So, and then we have three outstanding people. Marty Baron here to my left. I suppose many of you have watched Spotlight, the famous movie that received 7, 8 Oscars at that time. Was the story of the Boston Globe that had a big success many years ago, discovering the sexual abuses of the young people by the priestess. The editor-in-chief of the Boston Globe at that time was Marty Baron, here to my left. And he became one of the most rewarded and admired journalists, not only in this country, but all over the world. After that, Marty has accepted to be the editor-in-chief. Before that, he has been editor-in-chief of Miami Herald. So he speaks fluently Spanish for the Spanish people. And after the Boston Globe, he accepted to be the editor-in-chief of Washington Post at the time when the Washington Post has been bought by Mr. Bezos. And he has been for more than 7 years.
8 years.
8 years, editor-in-chief of the Washington Post. With a big success, he took over the Washington Post at the time of crisis, of all kind of crisis, credibility, economic crisis, readership, everything. And he left 8 years after with a real success all over the different aspects, economic aspects, credibility, etc. Then he will explain how he sees our profession, the journalistic professional journalist, which is important to control the power and to maintain and to defend the freedom of speech in the democracies. To my right is John Feeley. He is a very famous diplomat too. Why he is so famous? Because he started as a military, as a pilot, and then he moved into diplomacy, most of his time in Latin America, in many places of Latin America. And he is very famous because he was ambassador in Panama at the time of Mr. Trump won the election for the presidency. And once Trump took over as president, he resigned as ambassador in Panama, saying that he was not capable of representing a government headed by Mr. Trump. And to the extreme left of the table is Antonio Navalón. He's a very well-known journalist, more in Mexico than in Spain. He is a native of Spain. He has been working with me for Spanish radio and television, and for El País. He has been a contributor in public affairs and external relations, international geopolitics, during many years with many articles in El País. And now he's based in Texas and living in Mexico, New York, and Madrid. And well, everybody of us, we have decades of experience in journalism and diplomacy. And the question is how, as I told to you before, how the public opinion is going to be organized in democracies when polarization of politics is a real problem all over in the world. We do see it in this country, which we see it in most of the countries in Latin America and Europe, and that polarization is creating a damage for liberties, for the accomplishment of the rule of law. And we will start with Martin, and they will have 5 to 10 minutes to expose what they would like to expose. And after that, we will have a dialogue between us and with you.
Okay. I don't think I'll take 5 minutes, but I will start. I would add that, by the way, Thomas Jefferson later changed his opinion about the press after he became president. And I didn't like the press so much. So yes, he said some nasty things about the press. So as they say, where you stand depends on where you sit. Anyway, I would just start off saying that one of the question for this panel is whether independent journalism can survive, and I would say that it's very much at risk. I'm going to try to be the optimist in this panel. We just had lunch, and they're just so pessimistic that I feel an obligation to be an optimist. But it's not going to sound that way when I go through these challenges that we face. We are at risk, and I think democracy at risk. And those two things, I think, are very much linked. You can't have one without the other. You've never had a democracy without a free and independent press, and you can't have a free and independent press without a democracy. So they're related, and our fates are intertwined. I see really 4 major distinct challenges for an independent journalism today. The first, and perhaps most important, is that in our societies today, almost no matter where you are in the world, we in the public don't share a common set of facts. We can't agree on what even happened yesterday. And certainly here in the United States, there's still no agreement about what happened on January 6th, what happened during the election of 2020. The most basic facts we can't seem to agree on. And it's actually worse than that. It's that we can't even agree on how to establish what is a fact. What are the required elements for establishing something as a fact? Typically, we've relied upon things like expertise, education, experience, evidence, what I like to call the 4 E's. But now those are all being dismissed and devalued and discarded. Expertise, people don't believe in it. Experience is almost devalued. Education has also been devalued in many quarters. And we can't agree on what constitutes evidence. And that is a tremendous risk, I think. And this has become worse because of the internet, because of social media, and because people can find so-called information that reinforces their pre-existing points of view somewhere on the internet, and they will tell them that they are exactly right. And people like to hear that they are right rather than hearing that they are wrong. So it reinforces pre-existing points of view. The second challenge that I would mention is the power of technology, and what it's certainly a tool that can be used for good, but it's also something that is having some deleterious, some damaging impacts. And that is, the technology now has the power to disguise and to falsify what we regard as reality. So I think this has been very much accentuated and accelerated by generative artificial intelligence, which is the subject of a number of panels here. We are going to see more fabrications. It was interesting to me in a previous panel, when people are talking about generative AI, they talk about hallucinations, made up facts. We used to call those fabrications. Now all of a sudden they're calling them hallucinations, but in fact they are just falsehoods as they ever were. And this will be true. There will be more and more fabrications, especially within the realm of visual images, still images, and other images, film, and what have you. That'll be increasingly common, and so we won't really know what's true. And our power to detect and then disprove these fabrications is going to be diminished, and already is. And even if we are able to detect and disprove falsifications, falsehoods, We may not be able to do it in a timely fashion because this information or so-called information will be disseminated so rapidly everywhere because of the internet. The third challenge that I would mention is a well-known one in the field of journalism, and it's been going on now for a couple of decades, and that is financial instability. So most news organizations now continue to suffer from economic insecurity. This is really a plague. It's not going away anytime soon. It's not going to be conquered anytime soon. And if we don't have economic stability and sustainable economic models in journalism, it's not likely, it's highly improbable that we will have independent journalism. A threat to economic stability is a threat really to the ability of news organizations to fulfill their most basic task, which is to tell the public what is actually happening in their societies and in their governments. And the fourth thing that I would mention is rising authoritarianism and the trend toward authoritarianism in countries that have been traditionally democratic. Governments throughout the world are trying to escape criticism. They're trying to escape accountability. They have the tools now to repress and suppress the press and to circumvent the press, the traditional press. And we've seen that to great effect in countries, certain countries. Hungary stands out, Turkey stands out. We've seen it in Venezuela, of course, and we've seen it now to a very disturbing degree in Central America as well. And I should mention the United States, where there is a determined effort to undermine the credibility of independent press, to hurt its economic prospects, to basically subvert any level of confidence on the part of the public in independent journalism. So those are significant challenges. I may not have sounded like an optimist there, but we'll probably get to my optimistic part later in the conversation. But those are probably the four biggest challenges that I see for independent journalism today.
Thank you, Martin. Well, I think it's a good beginning for the discussion because you explained a very wide situation of the media. I will pass now to John the word.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. And I would like to especially thank the two ladies who are sitting on this side, because you boldly broke the segregation line that seems to have occurred. We look out at all of these blue blazers on the right, and I'm glad to see you here. Thank you very much. Above all, we want an integrated and diverse society. I share, and it won't surprise anybody, I share Marty's view that we are at a moment where media faces enormous pressure. He laid out 4 E's, which is a very good way to remember it. I think also in terms of the pressures on media. If you think about it, the pressures on media, which are not necessarily new exactly, but they have become far more, I would say, pressing in the last 30, 40 years, and certainly have been accelerated by the relentless march of technological innovation. The pressures come from governments, and Marty touched on that with authoritarianism. They come from opposition parties and those who would seek to govern and to have power. They come many times from corporate interests, a sort of veneration of the shareholder and the corporate model. In many cases, and certainly in the area where I tend to work in Latin America and here in the United States, truly it's all over the world, they may come from foreign governments. And this would be in the form of disinformation that is purposely sown and propagated throughout regions for the purposes of changing people's minds about a foreign people, nation, government issue. The Ukraine-Russia war is a perfect example of that. And then finally, and very worrisome, not in all countries, but certainly with the potential in all countries, are pressures on the media from organized crime, transnational organized crime, cartels. In many cases, these are the simplest to define. In Latin America, very frequently, you'll hear the expression plata o plomo. I'll either bribe you to say what I want you to say, or I'll just kill you. We face these on a global level. So what do you do about it? And while I recognize that the challenges are enormous, I think there are things that can be done. But what does that require? It truly, truly requires changing culture. And that does not happen overnight. So I think it is fair to say that we are in for very, very difficult sailing over the next few decades. I think this is going to take time to shake out. But one of the things that we can do right now is pick up that last E that Marty mentioned, education. We have to begin as societies and as democratic societies to inculcate in our youth the notion that getting information is not just a right, but it is a responsibility of citizens. Richard Haas has recently written a good book. Richard Haas was the former president of the Council on Foreign Relations, a very well-known organization here in the United States, kind of considered one of the grand poobahs, the Tlatuanis, for my Mexican friends, of American foreign policy. And he wrote a book, and it's called The Bill of Obligations. We have in the United States, and many people recognize, what's called the Bill of Rights. And it's extremely important in the United States. This was an addendum to our Constitution. Señor Presidente, bienvenido, por favor. This was an addendum to our Constitution. And American children are all taught in school some form of the Bill of Rights. And Richard Haas proposes, and I think many other people, myself included, would also propose, that there has to be a concomitant bill of obligations and responsibilities for the average citizen. And one of them is to inform herself or himself, and to do so in a way that affords, again, what Marty said, a common picture of reality. You know, I think it was Socrates who said that, you know, two men can look at the same set of facts and draw very different conclusions. That's perfectly acceptable. What's not acceptable, and where unfortunately we are, certainly in my country here in the United States, is where we have a presidential spokeswoman who says, well, you have your facts, but President Trump has his alternative facts. It was comments like that that led me to believe that I could no longer serve as the president's personal representative in an ambassadorial capacity. So I think we've got to come back to education, and it has to start young. And it has to start in a way that is genuinely, and this is difficult because you can't legislate it, and not everybody is a good person, but it has to start with a genuine recognition that if citizenship is so important to you, that you've got to begin to construct it again. There's another panel going on right now, and I'm sorry I can't be there, but it speaks about civics, teaching civics. In the United States, I'm got enough gray hair and I'm old enough to remember that civics was part of our course curriculum as kids. We were taught how to be a citizen. What are the responsibilities of being a good citizen? That is inextricably linked to media, because part of being a good citizen is being informed. A free and independent media is the only way that you will ever be truly informed, whatever the technology may be, whatever the platform may be. It could be a podcast, it could be an Instagram posting, it could be a long form article. Whatever it is, citizens have a responsibility to educate themselves. Media organizations have a responsibility to report with journalistic ethics at the forefront of every editorial decision they make. And I think that we have gotten to a point where people are so just distraught at the state of information. Whether you in the United States are a big progressive and you like MSNBC, or whether you are an extreme conservative and you think that Fox News is telling you the truth, the fact is that and this we did talk about at lunch, in the United States, journalism, journalists, and the media in general have suffered a serious crisis of confidence among the American people. And I think that the way back is to begin to address that crisis in confidence, and that comes with education.
Thank you. Antonio.
Well, before the panic, we have a lunch between us. Basically, I reach a conclusion is before this time, the question about who has destroyed or put in risk the independence and free journalism is true and is necessary because in all the time, the powers, political, economic, industrial, try to control the power of the mass media. The problem today is different. It's different because this is a new time. The first question is, who is in rule, who controls the societies today? The government? The mass media? Mass media is one time and another time questioned for the different president because the attack is in Mexico. The president saying the mass media is no system to have information, is system to have manipulation and sometimes extortion. Indefinitely, the most important thing for former President Trump, for actual President López Obrador, is destroy the rules of the mass media. First of all, no easy. The society don't need the mass media because they serve not the interesting like the truth, no define the legal structure during the time is present. They use his force to attack the government, especially the government actual who is in charge. One, because they say about himself that they is the victory of the people. The other, the President Trump, because he coming to the power to clean the whole society who maintain the American society in the political class. It's again the mass media, as is again the Capitol Hill, like he proved the 6th of January of the 2021. And basically, he don't need to make president more than one telephone. This is the most lethal destruction weapons that he has, the truth. The democracy is today under attack. It's true. In Israel, in the United States, in Mexico, and many, many countries. At the same time, the democratic system is under attack. But the problem is, first of all, the truth is not anymore like the fair condition for the journalists or mass media in commitment. Second, the government, they don't want to defend the legal structure under he win the election when they take the power. If more or less it is, I don't have exactly the number from China, but it is 4,000 million of people inside of the Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. How many journalists need to make the information every day about every situation? And somebody who acting or make information through the Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, he don't need to respect the truth. He don't need to do something or nothing according with the responsibility for his action. In few words, in my opinion, the principal defiant that we have against the good rules and the good interpretation of the mass media is first of all the consumer. The consumer realmente, they reach the conclusion that they accept like politic actuation, politic militants, they don't need to follow the rules of the paper of the mass media. Second, the government. The government try to take something about the taxes or the economic benefits for these companies. But any government today, they are disposed to defend the legal regulation, to defend the right of the people to have the independence, truly and complete information about what happened in the societies. With this problem, the mass media is in crisis. Nobody who have money putting today one journalist, TV or radio, because the market of advertising is real affected, or is element of the government, or is the enemy of the government, and they can't wait to win economic result without the only activity. Or you are inside of the biggest new owner of the situation is the technology, or the whole information is not truth or lie. Is depend of the logarithms who make, remember, and the initial, when Facebook changed his logarithms, they don't pay more. The mass media for use the information. They take everything, the intellectual property, the value of the communication, only to change one logarithm. And he established a big crisis. With all of this condition, all with radical defense of the legal structure of the countries, defense the value of the law and the authorization of the law, and respect for the truth can shape the rules and the paper for the mass media.
Thank you. Well, there are some issues that have been raised during these interventions. I would like to remember that every right is limited, but the law, when the rule of law is in fact what it is, the regular issue for a democracy. No? So the law, the rule of law is a limitation of liberty, and there are limitations of liberty to the right of information or the freedom of speech. Normally, there are legal acts in the common law countries that protect the privacy of the people, that protect the secrecy of the intimacy of the people for saying something. That law normally does not apply to the internet, because what happens in internet is not happening in the bad news, the post-truth, the fake news, etc., are transmitted by people who are not living in the place where the readers or the listeners exist. No? So there is a problem of rule of law in the limitation of liberty of speech. No? But I would like to insist that the first enemies of freedom of speech in democracies are governments. That is not my opinion. That is the opinion of MacGregor of Darris, who has been the chairman of the report of British Parliament at the time of the conflict with the tabloids, etc. saying that there are many people who are against the freedom of speech, but the main problem in democracies are the operations of governance, not only them. Now there is another trend, which is the auto-censorship in the newsrooms, which is increasing, at least in my country. And it is imposed even by the intellectuals and the academy, talking about political correction, saying that if there is a language which is politically correct, so there are some things that you shouldn't or you must not to tell like that. An example appear to be very extreme is the equality of gender or equality of sex. Reading the biography of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, when she won the first appeal because the equality of sex, he wrote that for his statement before the tribunal, and he gave to her secretary the speech to copy it. And the secretary, who was, by the way, in Spain, told to her, look, you are talking here about equality of sex. Sex is a very strong word. So, and she thought that is what I want, to see that the women and the men, they are equals and they have the same rights and duties. But the secretary told, how can I say that? And the secretary told to her, you can talk about the equality of gender. And then after that, we are talking about the equality of gender, but there are many feminist movements that if you talk about the equality of sex, they feel attacked, they feel upset. Well, there are many issues on that in the political life, no? And there is a lot of auto-censorship. I would like to know if you feel auto-censorship in the newsroom because people are feared to talk against Washington Post was the property of Mr. Bezos. He's a very powerful man, no? There are big companies that represent big interests of many other different issues than the information. How far the auto-censorship of journalists that they don't like to bother the editor-in-chief or the publisher or the owner of the company, how far that it is a problem in your view?
Well, journalists bothered me all the time, so it obviously wasn't a problem for them. They had no problem raising their voice and making their opinions known. So, which is really what they ought to be doing. At the Washington Post, yes, in 2013, in October, beginning of October 2013, we were acquired by Jeff Bezos, one of the richest people in the world. He acquired the company from a family, the Graham family, which had owned the Washington Post for 8 decades. And that obviously represented a great change, and there was great concern that he might interfere with our journalism. We were very fortunate, I have to say, that he didn't do that. He got involved in the business side, in the technology and marketing, pricing, all those sorts of things. But he committed at the very beginning, and he was asked about this, he committed at the very beginning to giving us our journalistic independence, and said that we could, in addition, that we could write about him and Amazon any way we wished. And he reaffirmed that commitment throughout my time there and never violated it. I can attest that he never did that. You know, at times we were accused of self-censorship, as you were referring to, but I don't believe that we did. And in fact, there's a journalist at Politico, an independent news organization here in the United States. The media writer actually evaluated it. He said that he had been looking for self-censorship since the time that Bezos had acquired it, but he couldn't find any. He found that we were at least as tough as other media outlets on Amazon and on Bezos, or even more so. Because one thing that journalists, certainly at the Washington Post, don't want is to be perceived as sort of puppets of the owner, and they wish to be perceived as completely independent. And I can tell you that if there had been any interference, I can guarantee you that there would have been a leak to other media organizations that there had been interference, and there never was one leak because there was no interference. And we were fortunate that way. I don't think that's the way that it necessarily would be at other news organizations. I don't believe that at all. And I can tell you that Donald Trump didn't want it to be that way. What Trump put a lot of pressure on Bezos. He tried to get its postal rates first double, then triple, then quadruple to hurt the business of Bezos because of Amazon, because of his ownership of the Post. He then interfered in a $10 billion cloud computing contract that was up for bidding with the Defense Department, and intervened essentially to take it away. It looked like Amazon was going to be the winner, and he intervened, and Amazon did not win the contract, almost certainly as a result. And so, but Bezos never said a thing to us about any of that, nor did he say anything to us about when we had to cover when he had an affair, as you may well know, and we covered that, and he didn't say anything about any of that coverage either. We were very lucky, but Trump definitely wanted him to interfere, to rein in our coverage, to control it. He thought that Bezos would do that, and he clearly wouldn't. And I think Trump thought that he could treat the Post and Bezos the way that he thought that Fox News worked, or he thought the National Enquirer worked, at other times where he had put pressure on people or tried to influence them, and they responded to that kind of pressure. And so he always felt that why would you own a media outlet unless your purpose was to influence its content? And that's not how Jeff Bezos thought about the Washington Post. He just didn't think of it that way. And even when we were covering Amazon, his view, and he stated it, and I saw he stuck to it, is that his view was that Amazon will do what's right for it. The Washington Post should do what's right for it. Sometimes those will be in conflict. And if that's the case, that's okay. You may write stories that are negative about Amazon. And if that's doing your job, that's doing your job. And Amazon may not even talk to you, which they typically didn't talk to us or to anybody else. And he was asked about that at the very beginning. People asked him, look, every time the press calls Amazon, they say no comment. How do you reconcile being in charge of a company that's constantly saying no comment to the press, and now you're the owner of a news organization? And he said, you have every right to ask the questions that you want to ask, and you should continue to do that. And Amazon has every right, if it wants to not answer your questions. And you do what's right for you. And Amazon will do what's right for it. And that's fine with me. So that was his thinking about all of that.
John wants to say something about it.
Just two quick comments. The first on what you said, Juan Luis, about the greatest threat to independent media is governments. I speak with the perspective of somebody who worked for the American government for 35 years, first as a military officer and then as a diplomat. And I could not agree more. Without a doubt, when I look around the world, when I look at the region where I spend most of my time in Latin America, the fundamental threat to independent media comes from governments. Why? Because they have all the leverage. If you think about it, a media outlet is a business. In the old days, all the governments used to do was make sure they couldn't get ink or paper, and they couldn't print their paper. Nowadays, it's much more difficult, but those pressures are still there, and they span a gamut. They go from a word from the presidential palace to the owner of the media, to actually just shutting down media, as we see in Nicaragua and Venezuela, and in places like Cuba. You haven't had a free press for over a half a century. And everybody who is a so-called journalist and works for an established media in Cuba is basically just a government propagandist. You have a very similar situation going on in Russia right now. So again, there's nothing new about this, but without a doubt, those 5 pressures that I listed at the beginning, I would place in there the most serious, that of governments. Now, how should it work? And I don't say that I lived in a halcyon era or in a moment where everything was perfect, but as an ambassador, I used to speak to the press all the time. Why? Because there was a symbiotic relationship. I needed the press. I was working on behalf of the American government in Mexico, in Colombia, in Panama. I needed to be able to communicate to the Mexican people, the Colombian people, and the American people who cared about those places, what we were doing. I needed the press. So there's a symbiotic relationship, and there were rules. And in truth, I never had an experience where anyone violated the rules. So things like background, speaking on background, speaking off the record, speaking on the record, all of these things are practices. And I would say that when we get to the issue of self-censorship, we are talking about the notion of how quickly or how fully should a newspaper respond to a particular development. Keep one thing in mind. Very frequently, there will be self-censorship because of a political force or a commercial force or somebody who has a lever of power over the media. But also, if a media is doing its job properly, there may be just a delay. There may be a desire not to report something just to make a deadline, just to get it up on the screen as breaking news, because they can't verify it. That's a fundamental practice of journalism. Good journalism is that you can verify exactly what you are reporting. It's not just a rumor. It's not just somebody who called you up and said, andan diciendo, people are talking, people are saying. One of the things I used to love about President Trump was how frequently he would say, a lot of people are saying, and then he would say, like, I'm the greatest president ever. I was like, I'd like to meet a few of those people if you wouldn't mind putting them up here. Journalists have always got an obligation and a responsibility to protect their sources, but they also have to have those sources. And then finally, just a quick note on political correctness. A lot of times political correctness is an issue of language. As Juan Luis mentioned, the issue of, I want to talk about equality of sex. Well, sex is kind of a neuralgic word. People get nervous around the word sex, so, hey, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, why don't you say equality of gender? Well, now today people define gender and sex, and there's discussions about fluidity, all of which are valid and good discussions to have. But language is extremely important, and language for journalism and media is exceptionally important. That's what it basically, it's that's what journalism is. It's words or images to convey thoughts. And that fundamentally comes back to how we communicate. And political correctness is, sort of what's allowed, what's not allowed. And I would just simply say the way that media can deal with this effectively is by establishing very clear standards of editorial conduct. Newspaper X will not spell out words that are commonly accepted to be curse words. Used to be that way, when Richard Nixon was a famous foul-mouthed president in the United States, and he used to curse with journalists all the time. When they would report what he said, they would never print the actual bad word, the mala palabra. They would always sort of play around with. Nowadays, you read, there are some newspapers that will actually print the curse word. Those are journalistic standards. Those can and should be set by publishers and editors and boards of directors of major or any media. But that's one way in which, if you make the rules clear and transparent, you can begin to address some of these issues of political correctness and, oh my God, you can't use that word because it offends me. And that just requires more work on behalf of journalists.
You want to say something about that, or we move into another issue?
No, really no, everything is say in torno a your question.
No, there is, my question is, when somebody asked me about the future of media, what future have media in a disintermediated society? Internet is disintermediation from the producer to the consumer, no distribution companies. Is less expensive and more fresh. And some 10 years ago, something like that, appeared the so-called citizen journalists. Because many times, I would say most of the times, when somebody takes a picture with his telephone or a video sent to a television or to a newspaper, so people don't need what is a journalist? I think to know about the future of journalists, we do need to understand what is a journalist. Eugenio Scalfari, who was the founder and founding editor and editor for a long time of La Repubblica de Roma, used to tell journalists is people who tells the people what happens to the people. And now the people tell what's happened to them directly in internet. They send the pictures, they send the videos, they send the voices, they send everything. And we created the citizen journalist that has been accepted, professionally speaking, by many media. And then the problem is that the professional journalist has some rules, again, rules. That trying to be accurate in the description of the facts, of the truth, of what happened, which is the most important thing. So they don't reveal the sources, which is very important. Even if they want, they should to go on jail because they don't accept the decision of a tribunal. They don't discover the sources. Then they try to confirm the facts with several sources. And finally, they try to explain that with the normal language, not to. But I would like to, starting by Antonio, what do you think about citizen journalists? And then what the professional journalists could do to survive? If the citizen journalist is
No, of course, no. My point is the journalists need, so I suppose, I'm expecting, they have preparation and rules. Somebody with his cell phone in the hands doesn't have more than his film and everything he or she tried to say and to send to the world. But especially is important in all the elements reference with the justice system. In our society, during many times, simple investigation or news is the equivalent on condemn or to declare guilty somebody. Of course, you need to have one preparation in order to say and to develop the history and finally to know that the judge, the prosecutor, many times the journalist is the instrument to make justice. And this is real dangerous in one side. And in the other, unfortunately, the campaigns through this bigger system is not enough to make any idea who stay more than minutes or hours. Because nobody has interested in investigate or prove any kind or case or accusation or proof. Definitely, I don't think that the rules for the journalists, no alone inside of the society, we have value rules and elements to defend, it can be no any substitution or shame for these all civil journalists that they will have one cell phone in the hand and they make.
So it's true that, any ordinary person can take a photo and take a video and supply that to the entire world instantaneously on the internet. But what you may not know is to what extent that was verified. You don't know what came before the video. You don't know what came after that video. You don't know if that video is a full and contextual representation of what occurred. And that gets at, I think, what are the values of what I would call a quality journalist. Anybody can call himself or herself a journalist. There's no definition, and in the United States, there's no license or anything like that. And there are many different kinds of journalists. But what I would consider to be a quality journalist would adhere to certain standards. Number one, a process of verification. Has to be what John was talking about before, is a process of verification. How do we know that what we saw is true? Not just that, that's number one. Number two, it's in proper context. So again, what happened before the video? What happened after the video? What are the reasons that this occurred? What was the impact that it had? What were the circumstances? Rather than just, here's a snapshot of what happened, make of it what you will, or make of it what I tell you it shows. That's not enough. Also, I think there has to be a level of transparency. You need to know who that person is. Before I retired a couple of years ago, my email was online, my telephone number was online, I make public appearances, you know who's behind the work, who stands behind the work. Our journalists' names appeared on their stories. In many instances today, what's being circulated is on Twitter that has a name that is a fabricated Twitter handle. It's not even a real name. So there needs to be a high level of transparency about who we are and how, and also importantly, how we went about our work to the extent that we can divulge that. And finally, I think the people who are quality journalists would subscribe to a certain code of ethics and a set of standards that would not be the case with any ordinary citizen who happens to be disseminating material across the internet. I do think that journalism actually does have an impact, even a significant impact, even in the world today, with disintermediation through the internet. I'm still waiting for somebody to show me the tweet that changed the world. I haven't yet seen the tweet that changed the world. I have seen a lot of journalism that's changed the world. And, I think of course, the investigation of the Catholic Church that I instigated at the Boston Globe, but also much of the work that we did, during the Trump administration in terms of holding the government accountable, and that's been done since, even during the Biden administration. I think it does have an impact. Even among college journalists here in the United States, we have a couple of recent examples, with the president of Stanford having to resign because of the college newspaper at Stanford University actually disclosing essentially wrongdoing on the part of the president in terms of the research that he did prior to becoming president. And at Northwestern, and holding their football coach accountable for abusive behavior. He had to resign as well. So the notion that journalism is somehow doesn't have an impact, is irrelevant in the day in an era of the internet, I think is not true. I think it still does have an enormous impact. Is it more difficult today than it was in the past? Absolutely. Are there more challenges today than there were in the past? Lots of challenges, far greater challenges today than there were in the past. But has it slid into irrelevance in a time of the internet and social media? I don't believe that we're there yet. And I still believe, and this is the optimistic part that I think I'm getting to, is that we still can have an impact. We still have an impact over the democracy. We still have an impact on, in the democracy, I mean, I think that you look at what things changed between 2016 and 2020 in the United States. People came to know more about who their president was during that period of time. They made their decision based on what they knew about him as a person, what they knew about him and his policies. And they came to a different conclusion in 2020, as much as Trump would like to deny that actually occurred. And so I think that the work does have a significant impact. And by the way, a lot of what gets disseminated over the internet is work that was actually performed by legitimate journalists.
Sure. At the risk of just sort of serially agreeing with what Marty said, let me take two things at what he points he made and just expand them. But I must say, I agree completely. And I'm also optimistic. I am not a journalist, as I said, but I started a foundation called the Center for Media Integrity of the Americas, because I believe there is absolutely a future for independent journalism. And what's more, I believe that it is an absolute necessity and a requirement. So let's go to like, what's the difference between the kid with an iPhone 14 and a journalist? The kid with the iPhone 14, he may film, or as we had here in this country in Detroit a couple of years ago, may film a horrible police beating, right? Those images are the same images that a trained journalist would capture were he or she on the scene. But it turns out it's a kid, right? 14, 15-year-old girl, and she uploads these things to the internet. And now, because of the speed and the rapidity with which the internet gets information out across social platforms, now people are inflamed, passions are inflamed on either side of the debate. And what did we see? Goes back to what Marty said. You got to put this in context. That's what journalism does. I would say another thing that journalism does that is extremely important is that it holds truth to power. I talked about at the beginning 5 pressures. Think of them as powers, right? Corporate entities have enormous economic power. Organized crime has terrible power that it can exercise in horrible ways. Governments, oppositions, foreign governments, they all represent power centers. Well, journalism holds a light up to that. It holds them accountable, but only if it does it with those ethical standards that include verifying information. Not 2, not 3, but as many times as you need to verify it, because we also know that when journalists cover a story, that story evolves, right? This is a dynamic process, especially if you're looking at investigative journalism. Actors in whatever scenario you're covering react. They react to the news. They react to what's known. They react to what police may be discovering about something. So the kid with the iPhone just captures the images. They don't do any of the extra work. Now, they're not required to. And I think one of the challenges that all journalists are going to have to deal with, and media has to deal with, is how do you compete in the information space with the kid with the iPhone 14? Because they're not going away. They're up there. One of these called them the citizen journalist, right? And that's a very common term, but I'm not so sure I really accept that term. I think that even though it's not regulated like the medical profession or like airline pilots, I think journalists have a common set of ethical beliefs that make them different than just the citizen journalist. I think maybe social media influencer is actually a better and more descriptive word of what we're talking about here. But I will absolutely recognize that, we're at a legal conference, so I should probably cite a legal precedent. One of the most famous statements about pornography in the United States was uttered by Justice Potter. He said, "I can't really tell you what it is, but I know it when I see it." Well, nowadays, if you apply that to journalism, you have deep fakes. You see it. Is it what you think it is? And I think in there, again, this is another responsibility of modern journalism that certainly wasn't around in the past. I think there are ways to say, to determine, if you see something, is it really what you're seeing? Take a look at some of the amazing work that's been done by digital journalists in the Russia-Ukraine war, with some of the images that the Russians have circulated of bombings and how effective their attacks have been. Well, those are images, right? There's code in all of those. Coders have gone in and they have been able to determine, wait a minute, this was manipulated. Hang on, the angle of the sun's declination is wrong. That attack didn't occur until this time, and the sun is way too high in the sky in this photo. That is a manipulated image. So in many ways, we're about to discover the technology will lead people of bad faith to create images that are wrong, misleading, and disinformation. But that very same technology is also fundamental to deciphering it and exposing it for the lie that it is.
I would like in this point to put you a question. I don't know if it is possible to answer that question. I've been for several years chairman of the International Press Institute, where we had a big discussion about ethics in information. So would be healthy for the profession and for the society to use stolen documents, for instance, in the name of the public interest? Should we accept the editor to do that? That was a little concrete, but till WikiLeaks appeared, or Snowden. WikiLeaks appeared, WikiLeaks was a robbery. And it has been distributed by a guy to several newspapers in the world, that including El País, that publish stored documents, secret governments, secret documents of governments that U.S. government told affected the national security and so on and so forth, etc. After that, Snowden did the same, more or less. So how far the professionalist journalists should to accept stolen documents to inform the public? How far the rule of law should to punish those editors and publishers if they do that? And how?
Okay, well, I think you're speaking to me here because at the Washington Post, we publish stolen documents and frankly, do it all the time. So, but the most famous case was probably, the most famous case in my instance were the Snowden documents. He provided those. That was the most highly classified information in the U.S. government. Involved highly sensitive national security information, and he provided enormous computer files, both to us and to the Guardian in England. And we made the decision, and it was my decision, to go ahead and publish the contents of those documents, not every last detail, not disclosing human sources, not disclosing precise locations and things like that. And because we did feel that there was a public interest, because what the U.S. government had put in place was a surveillance regime that was so extensive that had never been debated. There was an intrusion into the privacy of American citizens, not to mention citizens overseas. That was unprecedented in the history of the world, and that was likely to become even more intrusive over time. And if we had kept the confidentiality of those documents, well, first of all, the Guardian would have just gone ahead and published them. So there is the competitive factor, I have to admit. But at the same time, he could have just provided those to WikiLeaks, and WikiLeaks would have published them verbatim, every last one of them, without any restriction, without any judgment, without checking with the intelligence agencies, without withholding the names of human sources, without withholding the precise locations. There was every opportunity to do that. Snowden actually made the decision to provide them to media organizations that would exercise judgment over what made sense to publish and what didn't make sense to publish. And we felt that it was in the public interest to disclose that because otherwise there would be an ever-expanding surveillance regime in the United States without the public ever being aware that it's being surveilled, and that's represented a unprecedented intrusion into the privacy of American citizens, and it is something that could be abused even if it wasn't being abused by the government at the time, which was the Obama administration, it could be abused by an administration in the future. And I could very well imagine, given the way that American politics has turned, that kind of information would be abused if a certain American government had the opportunity to do so. And so, that's a judgment call. Every country has to decide what the level of punishment should be. The head of the national, one of the top intelligence officials in the United States suggested that people like me should go to prison for that. Thankfully, I'm here with you all today, rather than behind bars. And there were members of Congress who also felt that we should have been prosecuted. And it's quite possible that a different government for the United States might have made a very different decision and might well have decided to prosecute. But the Obama administration decided not to do that. And in fact, Obama actually said that this had brought forth the public debate that was necessary to have. And by the way, the biggest technology companies, which were being exploited for the purposes of this privacy intrusion, themselves were quite outraged by what was happening and had suggested that the U.S. government had gone way too far. So it's a judgment call. It's a judgment call on the part of, one of the things that you learn in journalism is that there are no formulas. And there are not always sort of correct answers and incorrect answers. There are judgment calls, and we have to make those calls. And in that instance, I made that call. And in other instances, we've been supplied documents that are so-called stolen. They might be documents of a private company. They might be documents out of the government. And we make a decision as to whether those are actually in the public interest. And at least in the system of the United States, thankfully, the government generally cannot step in to prevent publication. It can always penalize us after publication. So
John likes to tell something about WikiLeaks.
Right. WikiLeaks is what made me a published author. I had about 100 of the diplomatic cables that I had written over the course of my career that were published by WikiLeaks, and I was serving in the embassy in Mexico at the time, and it caused our ambassador at the time to be removed from his position based on the negative information that we had sent home in a classified confidential channel to Washington about then President Calderon's efforts to take on corruption and organized crime. Look, the issue of, I spent a long time writing cables that were meant to be classified. They were not meant to be shared with the public. In many cases, those involved national security secrets and issues that, had they been revealed, would have done significant damage to the United States. There were plenty of journalists who would have loved to have gotten a hold of them. I think that, as Marty said, these are judgment calls on the basis of, by journalists as to what is their purpose. If you take a look at the Panama Papers, another case that I had a lot of engagement with as the U.S. ambassador in Panama when that case broke, what was the company doing? What was Mossack Fonseca doing? They were abusing the law, and they were hiding the beneficial owners of the offshore companies that they were starting up. And those beneficial owners, hidden from all records, except for the very few people inside those companies who put up people like janitors and chauffeurs to be the company's directors. Those people were very frequently funneling money from illegal activities, whether it was arms trafficking or drug trafficking or government corruption, into those companies. The exposure of those companies by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists is something that I absolutely support. Why? Because it shows light on a power, right? This was a very powerful law firm, and the ability to set up offshore accounts, we know, is one of the things that propels organized crime and corruption around the world. And so this was a journalistic effort to expose that. They had somebody come to them and they used it only after they verified, they went through, they had enormously detailed editing processes and verification processes. What's the difference between that and WikiLeaks? And this is the argument I will make. WikiLeaks wasn't looking for any one particular story. WikiLeaks was not looking to see what the United States government was or was not doing with regard to issue X. And WikiLeaks suborned, and when I say suborned, not with money, but WikiLeaks founder, Julian Assange, manipulated a very, very confused young person in the US military. And if you take a look at the communications between him and that person, today known as Chelsea Manning, you will see that he was pushing him to just go in and literally, like a kid in his parents' liquor cabinet, just take everything you can get whatever you can. And what did they do? They just threw it all up on the internet. Well, I'm here to tell you that I know of a number of people who were killed as a result of that exposure. There was no responsibility that I saw in the editing of it. There wasn't even really any horrendous new revelations. The biggest revelation that I often heard was, holy cow, the American embassy guys really aren't that stupid. They kind of know what's going on in country X, Y, or Z. In a way, it was almost like a backhanded compliment, but it was the intent. The intent was simply to shame the government of the United States by putting up all of its secrets, much as you would say, a spurned lover would say, go and steal my ex-girlfriend's diary, and then I'm going to put it all up on the internet. That's the difference.
Antonio, would you like to comment on that?
I think it's obvious that for many, many years, the capacity to maintain the secret that any government tries to maintain either is one of the principal elements. I remember another case, like the paper of the Pentagon, and many, for not speaking torno Watergate, but this today, and this is important for me, like reference, that how many things changed this year. This country imposed the resignation to the President of the United States for life, for make alive. And the Washington Post make with his investigation and the Bradley and Grandis and bigger journalists make the democracy and the essence of the democracy. The national security issue is the big element to protect any confidential information. But the society is better if we can explain and use everything that the government made not according with the law, including if they have laws who pretend don't make public this thing. I remember perfectly the WikiLeaks issue and the Assange. And I remember inside. It's truth that the one important newspaper of the world publishing almost all the information. The sacred agreement is to protect the people because some information can create personal dangers over people who work for the government. And for me, it's the clear and most evident case that what is the behavior that the one newspaper need to do in something like this. The whole WikiLeaks don't know made public. But this initiative is critical, like the same who living personally, Martin. Definitely, I agree, we take the risk. And if the journalists don't stay present in the society, nobody take the responsibility to do this.
I would just mention what happens in societies where you don't have an independent press. So you look at Russia, everything is classified. Everything is national security. Even the language is a national security. You can't call it a war in Ukraine. You have to call it a special
Military operation.
special military operation. And if you violate that, you go to prison. And even in the United States, you know, the level of classification for documents has just gone up and up and up. Everything's being classified. Some of the things that we saw classified, frankly, even in the Snowden cases, for example, we would we would always go back to the intelligence agencies and say, this is what we intend to publish, raise any objections you want. We want to listen to you, any concerns. And sometimes they would object to something and we would say, but that was already published. And they would say, yeah, but we don't think anybody read it. And some of the documents that are classified in the US government are actually articles that appeared in the mainstream press. They classified those documents. And it's astonishing just how much gets classified. Well, in places like Russia and in places like in many other authoritarian regimes, China, everything is classified. And all you can say is what the government wants you to say, because anything else would be a threat to the state. And you know, obviously there's some sort of balance that needs to be struck. There are national security secrets. Certain things obviously need to be kept secret, but we have to be careful not to say never publish a stolen document because it's stolen.
There are still 10 minutes to finish. If there's somebody in the audience that would like to raise the question.
There are two thoughts that we raised today. One, two thoughts that we raised today. In the United States, but
Hold it at a distance. Go ahead.
in the United States, but certainly in totalitarian regimes and now authoritarian regimes, the rewriting of history is absolutely central. We're watching it in Florida and Texas right now, where apparently we're going to write slavery out of the history of the United States, the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, what have you. So civic education is also a battleground and doesn't go without saying. And the second issue I wanted to raise is sort of citizen journalism. You talked about the sort of unfiltering of just lifting something up into the internet, and I couldn't agree more. On the other hand, if those pictures had not been taken, if that film hadn't been taken, we wouldn't have known that it had happened because, you know, for example, police brutality, we're very aware, and this is not just the United States, this is anywhere in the world, the whitewashing of what goes on or the non-reporting of it at all. And I'm thinking in particular in the destruction of local journalism, not just in the United States, but across the world, right? The viability of local journalism has just become untenable, right? You can't, and again, not just in the United States, we're talking about, talk about a country like Argentina that does have a vibrant press and a history of a vibrant press, but the local press has just disappeared. And at some level, we're going to have to rely on citizen journalism for any accountability, in particular at the local level, for just to even know what's going on. As just look at the United States, you have council meetings, you have zoning meetings, et cetera, that all of a sudden have become private, that the violation of the open meetings, et cetera. So I do think that, one of the intermediation between organized press and sort of citizen journalism is going to have to take.
Oh, sure. I'm not arguing against somebody posting a video of let's say a police beating or something like that. I wouldn't call them citizen journalists. I would just call them citizens. And they post it because they haven't actually practiced journalism. Taking a photo is not called journalism. It's not journalism. So I would urge that. I think we have to be really careful about that because we don't know if the video was staged. Somebody has to do the process of verification. Somebody has to go check out the facts, talk to people, interview people, things like that. And that's journalism. Otherwise, you don't know what the circumstances were. You don't even know if that wasn't a staged event. All right. It wasn't. We're thinking about George Floyd here, but that obviously was not. It was a terrible police beating. And thankfully, someone posted it, and she actually was given a Pulitzer Prize for that work. So, that's absolutely necessary. But you can't stop there. I would disagree with you on the say we need to rely on that. We can't just rely on that. We need to have those strong local journalism. We do have to figure out a sustainable model for local journalism because without that process of reporting and verification, you don't really know what you have. And if you don't know what you have, you probably shouldn't rely on it.
Last question there.
I got to know the question to say, but earlier said UNESCO category in Paris and really for 10 years of trying to protect freedom of expression. So journalists, one of the real different things that we're facing now is that pressure that after the nation, the 40s, the Martin and nation, they before were like isolated phenomena with different countries. You have violence here, you have pressures there, you have economic problems here. But now we have a perfect storm that all those pressures, they are being seen very much everywhere, including in the so-called consolidated democracies. Yeah. For instance, in all 9 countries, this is happening everywhere. Or these lawsuits against public there happening everywhere. So that's one of the difficult phenomena because how you face these perfect storms is much more. But I want to, because this preamble class, there is a first question to the media viability. We, at UNESCO, with others like Stiglitz and we have been insisting on the idea that we need to think journalism as a public good. And as many other public goods, being water, museums, etc., the only way to fund that is with taxpayers. But with journalism, you add a problem that's not easy to solve. Is that how you do that, and at the same time you keep it part of the hands. And I know there is no simple answer to that question. Maybe there is no answer, but I would like to hear if there are some thoughts, because this is one of the big problems we are facing right now. Maybe it is a public good, but how we fund these taxpayers' money without strings attached.
Well, the panelists, they have 1 minute each for answering this question because we have to finish.
In 1 minute, there is no easy answer to it, but you are asking the right question. I think that it should be considered a public good. However, the notion that journalism has a relationship of friction to all power by definition means that you are always going to have multiple views of a particular set of accepted facts and things like that. So for that reason, I'm not sure if we're ever going to get to a scenario where I pay taxes for journalism the way I do for water services or garbage pickup services or other governmental services. I think that looking at a combination of a philanthropic source and perhaps combined with subscriptions, perhaps combined with a commercial viability. It used to be selling ad space, and it used to be subscriptions back when we all just had newspapers. But I think it's going to emerge that it will be some kind of amalgam as to how media is financed, and we can pay for the journalists to do the kind of investigative work we want, so that we don't just see images put up on the internet with no context and with no story and narrative to them.
Well, a lot of people are looking at public financing in the United States. I'm very skeptical of that because all you need to do is take a look at what Trump did with the Voice of America. He fired the people in charge. He fired the independent journalists, and he put in a political ally in charge of the Voice of America, which had, while funded by the government, had been independent. So if government provides the resources, then politicians will use the resources as leverage over those media outlets, and then they won't be independent. And they will become dependents, actually. They will become dependents on the government. And I don't know how you can have independence while the media is a dependent on the government. And so we need to find a sustainable model for local journalism. I'm not ready to give up on that. I think there's some signs of promise. It's hugely challenging. It doesn't look that promising at the moment, but I do think there's some signs of promise. And that is really where I think we should devote our attention.
Fortunately, it's possible to think that the mass media or the public company can receive any support for the public money. First of all, because from the time of the Jefferson, the total phrase is not only I prefer government newspaper and no government without newspaper. And then he followed, it's important that everybody has the capacity to read and receive the information. This is true. But the problem is the newspaper is one of the part of the structure of the power of the societies. And his capacity and power depends to have the total capacity to win money, maintain the company in good health, and pay the salaries that the good newspaper journalists can with his work. In this case, the crisis of the press or the mass media, the actual crisis, is impossible to try to combine with, for example, PBS structure or cualquier other structure who permit the subsistence of the companies. The important is not only the government, the important is, and the problem is in grand part, us. What it exactly, for what we pay, what class of product we receive. And at least in the United States, and I think in other democratic countries, it's impossible to study the capacity to receive money who maintains the companies.
So thank you very much, the panelists. Thank you very much, the audience. As a summary, I've been doing newspapers for more than 60 years in my life, and I want to be as optimistic as Marty is. So the question of the panel was, is going to survive the journalist profession? Yes, I do believe it's going to survive. I don't know how, but it's going to survive because I do believe the people will need people who tells the people who what happens to the people. Thank you very much.